Hello, I'm Davis, and this is my wife, Rachel, and we're going to talk about how to break free from the public school mindset. So when you think about homeschooling, you may have heard some people say that it's a lifestyle, but what's actually behind that? What do people actually mean when they say homeschooling is a lifestyle?
I think they really mean that it means that you're not thinking like you do if you put them on a bus, right? So if you're putting them on a bus, you're thinking, okay, this is school time, and this is home time, family time, and I will even go so far as, and this is church time. When I really think if you have a God, gospel-centered view of the world, all of that's one thing, right? It's all interwoven. The education is interwoven with the family, is interwoven with your walk with God. It's all together. And so that's what the lifestyle would look like, is you're doing all of those things all the same time, all the time.
Well, it really is a paradigm shift.
It is.
So I like to think about how we named our particular homeschool.
Right, and you did that.
It doesn't sound like the most creative name in the world. It was the Carman Family Homeschool.
Right.
But every one of those words is very specific, because when you think about doing things as a family, and when you think about doing things at home, and then our last name, really it's as simple and as complex as that.
Yeah.
But it's not bringing the public school experience home.
Yeah.
And that's what can often happen when people homeschool, is they take whatever education experience they had,
Yep.
whether it was public, private, and bring it home. And that's why they often say, well, how can you possibly do this at home by yourselves without help? And what about all these other details?
Right.
Well, what you need to do is break out of that mold and say, hey, we're a family
Yeah.
that's going to meet at home. These are our children, and we're going to train them, raise them, to develop them educationally, spiritually, physically, and all of that together. And suddenly everything becomes simpler at home, because you're in charge of
Definitely.
the schedule,
Yeah.
you're in charge of the curriculum. I always like to think of the home as the place that doesn't have a cafeteria because it's got a kitchen.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a gym because it's got a backyard. It doesn't have a long line in the bathroom.
Right.
You go when you need to go.
Right.
I mean, it's
No hall passes.
doing life.
Yeah, I know.
Right, no
Yeah.
hall passes. It's actually much simpler and much more freeing. And so one other phrase to help think of this paradigm shift or this lifestyle is, when you homeschool, you need to feel the freedom.
Yeah.
And so many of us have been basically prisoners, locked in an institution for so long that we don't know how to do anything without asking permission.
Exactly.
But when you homeschool, you're in charge. Everything is stopped at mom and dad's desk. How do you want to do this? What do you want to do? And you have to feel the freedom and take advantage of the freedom to do it well. But that's where a lot of us have to get outside of ourselves.
Well, and I think you have to give yourself a break too, right? So a few years ago, when it was my 50th birthday, we went and jumped out of a perfectly good airplane just to do it, because we thought it'd be fun to go parachuting. I've always wanted to do that. But at the end of that, when we're back on the ground, we talked about how it was like this overstimulation, all of this coming at you at once, and it was really quite overwhelming. And I think that can be the same feeling when people jump out of the perfectly good airplane, although I'm going to argue that the public school system is not a perfectly good airplane. When they're actually stepping out in faith to do this thing called homeschooling, it can be completely overwhelming. All of this is rushing at you, all of this freedom. You feel like you're free falling, right? It's terrifying, and you're hoping you're going to land well. You're hoping your parachute's going to come out. You are. I want to advocate for giving yourself grace to walk in. You're not going to figure this out overnight. You're not going to figure it out. We pulled our son out of the system on a Friday with no idea what we were doing on Monday. And I remember that weekend was so scary. I called everybody that I knew.
All three people.
And I said, what do I do? What do I do? I almost could not breathe. And I remember the best answer I got scared me. She said, just snuggle on the sofa and read to him. And I was like, yeah, that's not helpful. Because what do you mean snuggle on the sofa with him? He needs to be doing something. And she was just like, Rachel, just relax. So as you're stepping out, And I kind of hope that you're stepping out, not jumping out. But as you're stepping out, you still get that free fall feeling. Walk in some grace. Know that it's going to be a process to really lean into the freedom that you're getting. Because like for you and me, I'd always gone to school. You'd always gone to school. We had references for school bus, who sits on the school bus, where you sit, where it's safe, who's the bully. We knew the jungle code. We knew the bells ringing and the classes changing. We knew about detention. We knew about late work. We knew about worksheets. We knew about all of this stuff. We knew about lockers and the cafeteria. We didn't know how to do this at home, and yet we did. And so I want to encourage parents, you do know how to do this. There's so much about this. But what's happened is we have so expertized education that we forget just how much we really do know how to do.
Right.
We know our kids better than anybody else.
Well, when you think about
know them better
what
than
you've
anybody.
taught your kids to do in the
Already.
first 5 years of their
Yes.
life, without any certification in
Right.
walking, talking, it's amazing what you have taught your own kids
Right.
just by being a parent to a young one. And that can continue after age 7 into high school. But you also mentioned that you need to give yourself grace. And I would say that it's very common for the first 1 or 2 years to be pretty rocky and rough and overwhelming. But if you stick with it for 3 or 4 years, you'll start to figure it out. You'll get used to what works, what doesn't work. You'll be brave enough to change the curriculum if you need to. You're going to actually start understanding your kids and their nuances, what makes them tick, what's exciting to them, what's interesting. And suddenly a whole new world will open up for you and your kids that I like to say, persevere for 3 or 4 years. Stick with it for that long, and you will probably figure it out to where you're going to stay with it for the rest of the time because you know it's good for you, it's good for your kids. Yes, it's hard work, and it's taking, the sacrifice isn't going to disappear. It's not always going to be easy, and there's going to be years that are tough and maybe even discouraging, but you know that overall, this is so much better than any other option. It is the ideal way to raise and educate your kids, but it does take that mental shift to have a different mindset, paradigm shift, a lifestyle, however you want to word it, because it is very different, which is one reason why most people say, I could never do that, because they have a mental idea of what homeschooling looks like that's actually incorrect. And I love that in the spring 2020, all 60 million K-12 kids in America were homeschooling. Everybody had a mandatory trial run of this in some way, shape, or form, and it caused a lot of families to say, oh, we can do this. I didn't think we could, but we actually can. Or it caused them to look behind the curtain and say, oh, I didn't realize it was that bad. We've got to get our kid out of that scenario. And that's the beauty of it. When you start homeschooling, then you get an actual taste of what it might actually look like for you and your family, but you probably still have to give yourself 3 or 4 years to really work out the bugs and figure out the details and to feel the freedom in a way that works.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that with this one caveat. A lot of people, the trial run was all screen driven. And so if that's what you think homeschooling is, you're wrong, right? So you have to kick the screen out the house, and then you've got homeschooling, sitting on the sofa reading with your kids, none of the worksheets, none of the drudgery, right? It was really the joy. And I think you're right. Some people caught a glimpse of the joy. Some people saw the hideous monster behind the curtain, and they got the opportunity. Some people equated their kids sitting in front of a screen for 8 hours as homeschooling. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about true freedom, where you get to figure out what you're going to do, what your regular day is going to look like, what you're going to study, what you're going to read, based on your family, who your kids are, and what you all enjoy, and how you can best pursue God. That's what we're talking about. But it's a process, because if you have been indoctrinated, if you have gotten to where you're really used to the pattern of the bus, man, it's going to take you a little while to step away from that. But there is so much freedom in stepping away from that and leaning into the lifestyle available to you, really to enjoy being together, enjoy good literature, enjoy being out in God's creation, all of these things that kids don't do very much anymore, right? So I was a secondary ed teacher before we got into homeschooling, and some people think, okay, well now your story makes sense. I think that was a detriment to me as a homeschooler.
It was more of a disadvantage for you.
It was, because it was so system focused, and how the scope and sequence and everything was supposed to be just so, and that was detrimental to me as a homeschool mom. But when I was teaching in my classroom, we read whole books, like not just a chapter from Moby Dick. We read Moby Dick, and a lot in the public school system now, what they're doing is they're only reading excerpts. They're only getting bits and pieces. They are extracting out of the context of a whole a piece. And in the homeschool setting, you get to read the whole. You really get to do the whole thing. And that's what it means to step away from the system, to reject. They want to say that their high school graduates from this high school read all of the Harvard reading list.
And they didn't.
No, they didn't. They might have read a chapter from everything on the Harvard reading list, but they didn't read the Harvard reading list. In your homeschooling, you can step away. You can reject that model, and you can read whole things of scripture and whole passages of literature, the whole book, not even just part of it, right?
Well, once again, you're in charge.
You're in
of the
charge.
curriculum, so you can decide how much, which ones, and it's such a beautiful thing to be able to customize it. And yet, you got to realize you're not going to be able to do everything.
No.
So you just pick and choose what is important to you and your family.
Exactly.
Now, going back to the disadvantage of being certified as a teacher,
Yeah.
I remember you often talk about how you were taught to aim for the middle and hope for the ends.
Right. The bell curve.
Right, exactly. And when you homeschool, you're aiming for each individual child. And you think about it, we had a large family of 7 kids. That's a 3.5 student to teacher ratio if you include both of us. So
Yeah.
It's one of the best settings you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
So the beauties, the advantages to homeschooling are great. It's a big decision.
Mhm.
It's not easy. It's hard work, takes lots of sacrifices, but it is the ideal. Homeschooling works. It's good for your kids. It's good for you, but you do have to change your mindset.